Hello and welcome to India Back on Track, an agenda for reform. This is the first show in a three-part series that Network 18's Think India Foundation is producing in partnership with the Washington, D.C.-based Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, one of the world's finest and most influential think tanks. Many of you would have followed Think India's recently concluded 14-part series, Change India, an agenda for the next Prime Minister. Our partnership with Carnegie is a second attempt to reignite the economic reforms agenda in India when the new government takes office in June. India Back on Track is based on a book that will shortly be published by the Carnegie Endowment, which has essays written by leading Indian thinkers. Joining us in the studio to preview the book are its co-editors, Ashley Tellis, who is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, and Vivek Debroy, eminent economist and professor at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. With them is Dheeraj Nayyar, CEO of the Think India Foundation. One of the many themes discussed in the book, out of those, three stand out. Greater faith in free markets, the need to decentralize authority to the states, and an emphasis on policy implementation rather than grand ideas. Let's start with freer markets, a theme that is at the core of Think India's mandate. Ashley, you know, I've been sort of watching the Indian reform program from the early 90s very closely. And one of the things which strikes me is the diminishing faith in free markets over the 20 years. The first 10 years we seem to put much more faith, and then we sort of lost it. Is that something that comes through in your book as well?
Well, it certainly comes through in the sense that most of the suggestions in many of the issue areas clearly emphasize that you run away from markets only at great costs to your success. Mm-hmm. And so there comes a point where you cannot approach markets defensively. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason, I think, for the trend that you identified was that the Indian willingness to consider markets in 91 mm-hmm. was not because of a philosophical transformation,
right,
but as a response to crisis.
Yes.
And so India did what was necessary to circumvent the crisis of the moment.
Right.
And when things got better,
yes,
in a sense, it was easy to go back to the bad old ways.
The familiar faith that you have in, or suspicion that you have of the market.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So now the question is, when India has to make some hard choices about sustaining growth over the long term, mm-hmm. what is the best social institution we know mm-hmm. to make that happen? Mm-hmm. And I think the book makes the case quite compellingly mm-hmm. that there is a role for the state, and a very important role for the state,
sure.
but it cannot be to the neglect of markets,
yes.
whenever and wherever necessary.
So specifically, where would you emphasize the need to reignite the role of the markets?
Well, I think one would have to do that in almost every issue area mm-hmm. that the book looks at. But a very good example would be with respect to energy. Mm-hmm. There is a very compelling case to be made that India is a very wasteful user
right.
of an incredibly scarce resource.
Right.
Its foreign policy is driven by a search for secure energy sources. A great deal of effort is made in the national economy to economize on the use of energy.
Right.
And yet, the single best thing that India could do, which is to liberalize the markets for the consumption of energy,
right.
is something that India is very hesitant about.
Yes.
And
or does it very falteringly?
Or does it very falteringly?
Yes.
So
and stop-start. We went in the early 2000s, we went ahead and then we pulled back, and now we are doing 50 paisa per sort of month or 5 weeks for diesel. Vivek, among the other areas where free markets would need to get a quick play, what would you identify would be the first few priorities of the next government?
Well, I'd like to make three very quick points. Firstly, sure. There has been a problem with regulation in India, or its lack, or mm-hmm. its inadequacy. And because there's been that problem, there's been the distrust of markets, and therefore one has confused regulation with control. And consequently, in the last few years, we've seen control masquerading as regulation.
Right.
The second quick point I'd like to make is this book is primarily targeted at a government in Delhi. Mm-hmm. There are only X number of things that a government in Delhi can do, and there are several things that are in the domain of the states.
Right.
But to quickly give you an example of something that illustrates this difference between regulation and control and dependence on markets is, let us say, technology. By technology, I mean something like, let's say, BT technology. Mm-hmm. Now, BT technology, subject to whatever regulatory standards you have, the market would require that decision to be left to the farmers.
Right.
So why is a government in Delhi trying to preempt that choice and preventing that choice by farmers?
That's an interesting example you raise, because there seems to be now almost every mainstream party, and I was reading just now that even the BJP seems to believe that genetically modified crop technology is something that they would be suspicious of. So this is going to be a very uphill battle for you to get people to be convinced about this particular example.
This particular example, yes. But the examples across the spectrum.
Right.
I would pick higher education also as a very good example of
Absolutely,
that.
yes.
Not school education, because that again is partly the domain of the states. But higher education is a very good example where we are again mixing up regulation with control.
Right. Dheeraj, you know, the thing here is the entrenched suspicion of the markets. You want to appoint a regulator, you go to an ex-IAS officer. You have a problem with transfer pricing rules and taxation, you take the most severe, the strictest definition, and then you apply sort of pretty coercive rules and say, now you put down a couple of $1 billion, otherwise your business is going to shut. Yeah. How do you address that?
Yeah, I think there's been a bit of a backlash against the markets in the last 4 or 5 years, especially with the rise of corruption and the association of crony capitalism with India's sort of rapid decade of growth. Now, that is something which is going to need to be addressed by the next government. Now, one way to do it is to do good regulation, of course, and Vivek says regulation often gets confused with control, partly because of the personnel you put in charge of regulation.
And partly because that's a very convenient whipping boy.
Exactly. And so it's very bad practice, which generally happens in India, that a person who heads the telecom ministries as secretary then goes on to become the telecom regulator.
That's right.
Or it always happens across sectors. The person who makes the policy, who actually controls the sector, then goes and becomes a regulator. So those kind of things need to end. I mean, you need to get in good personnel from outside. But the next government has a good opportunity, because what we have seen over the last 5 years is that the government is pretty bad at fixing prices, which is one of the things they've been trying to do across a whole range of natural resources. And that has led us to corruption at one level and inflation at another level, because fixing prices of agricultural commodities, banning exports, it's distorted the agricultural economy, and we are saddled with this huge food inflation problem. So there is a popular case to be made that markets would be more efficient, and not only more efficient, but they would actually deliver to the public at large less corruption, less inflation.
And therefore, setting of prices to the extent 99% plus possible.
I think we used to do this price and quantity intervention all the time before 91. How much steel will be produced at what price?
The license quota Raj.
We stopped it in some, but now we've moved from sort of commodities to resources, so spectrum. Slow changes are happening, but we need to do a lot more.
You'd be surprised even entertainment content prices are regulated in this country. Can you believe that entertainment content prices are regulated?
That's crazy. It's crazy.
Before I go into a break, I just want one very quick intervention from you. You know the phrase that Dheeraj used, crony capitalist. I somehow believe that there's one thing that should be banned in this country. This phrase should be banned because it's completely misleading. It's actually crony socialism. Where there are controls, there are crony capitalists, not where there are efficient markets.
Absolutely. In fact, controls are the best thing that happen to the commercial classes that want to manipulate outcomes.
That's right.
And so the more you can deregulate, in the best sense of the word, the stronger the weapons you have against so-called crony capitalism. And so you have to go back to creating well-ordered markets with impartial rules and regulators that will enforce the rules as opposed to individuals or entities that seek to produce certain outcomes.
Right. So, interesting discussion. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about the compelling need now to move towards a genuinely empowered economic federation and the need to now implement some of these ideas. Stay with us. We'll be back after this very short break. Welcome back to India Back on Track. We are discussing here a forthcoming publication from the Carnegie Endowment that hopes to revitalize India's stalled economic growth story. The second big point for discussion today is the need to get economic federalism genuinely empowered and implemented in this country. Vivek, there's been a lot of talk. Almost every prime ministerial candidate, almost every chief minister now talks about this. What are the 2 or 3 things that are needed to really get it done?
It's not just economic federalism, it's federalism, because there are non-economic dimensions of that also. Firstly, we need to recognize that the powerful representation from the states is going to be there. So therefore, at one level, one is talking about rehabilitating things like the Interstate Council, the NDC, even something like the NCTC. So this is at one particular level.
But how do you genuinely empower these bodies? They exist. They meet once in a year.
They exist as in an ornamental kind of fashion.
Correct.
The second element is actually economic, and there what we are really talking about is a large number of areas that are technically areas that are reserved for states under the 7th schedule, but the center has consistently been passing laws, etc. on these.
These are what are popularly called concurrent list items, is it?
Yes, concurrent list items. And the
Right.
third is the role of the Planning Commission and the Finance Commission, and the role of the Planning Commission particularly through a large number of centrally sponsored schemes which are actually implemented by the states. So what we need to do is, and there's decentralization within the states also as an issue,
Right.
inside the states.
Right.
But what we need to do is to gradually give more power to the states, tweak these programs,
Right.
and perhaps even abolish them.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So what is the big idea could be, if these are ornamental and some of these things are not working, or some of these things are actually militating against the concept. For instance, the Planning Commission. I mean, it's been a sort of almost a holy cow that has existed for the last sort of 60 years. Is it time to now do away with it, Ashley?
Well, I always thought it was somewhat incongruous to have a planning commission because no one quite was able to demonstrate that planning would deliver what its protagonist said. Now, having said that, the role of the Planning Commission has evolved.
Yes.
But I think the country really needs to rethink as it evolves to more market solutions and as the market gets more and more enthroned in terms of economic decision making, whether an institution like the Planning Commission has actually outlived its usefulness.
Right. Even the Finance Commission, does it need to be now re-architectured?
I certainly think so. I certainly think so.
In what particular way?
I mean, the way I think about it is the point that Vivek just made, which is if you do not have practical empowerment of the states, give them both the resources and the capacity to set their own agenda, it's going to be very hard to create all India solutions because India's diversity and the differences in the states across the nation is so graphic that to try and manage it all from a central node like Delhi is a proposition that is quickly going to reach the limits of its success.
Yeah, that's true. Dheeraj, you know, we talk about organs like the Interstate Council or the NDC. On the other hand, we have the Central Cabinet. Now, some would argue that constitutionally all the power vests with the Central Cabinet. If you were to devolve some of this power to these bodies, will that militate against the structure of your constitution?
Personally, I would not be in favor of too many of these bodies because a lot of them descend into talk shops where a lot of talk happens and nothing gets done. So I would say abolish centrally sponsored scheme or reduce them significantly and just transfer resources to the states and let them use them as they feel fit. Why impose a central scheme which may be appropriate for one state but may be completely inappropriate for the other?
Right.
And I think again, this is a good moment for federalism because there is of course the rise of regional parties which has been a fact. But the fact that...
Which is actually a manifestation playing out on the ground.
And the fact that a major national party is being led by a chief minister this time around, the BJP has actually a chief minister as prime ministerial candidate, whatever your arguments for or against him, the fact that he's a chief minister and he has run a state gives one the feeling that at least federalism will take center stage in one way or the other through this campaign and maybe afterwards as well.
2 out of the 3 prospective contenders for the job are actually chief ministers of states. So, Vivek, in the recent budget we saw a fairly significant move towards devolving more financial autonomy to the states. Is that enough, or does that need to now go to some kind of logical end, and what is that logical end?
Well, the logical end, two quick things. You see, one is not really trying to reinvent the Finance Commission. One is trying to restore its original constitutional mandate, which was diluted in the course of the 1970s. And it was primarily diluted through the centrally sponsored schemes. What you have seen in the recent budget, interim budget, is just a reduction to 66. Now, why 66? We probably don't need any of those. We can have the kind of strings necessary, but all of this should be devolved through the Finance Commission and within the states through the state finance commissions.
Right. Okay. Third point that I think the book intends to make, Ashley, and this is about the importance of implementation. A lot of people would say in the last 10 years, or 15 years, what India has done very well is to bring all the problems on the table, has written some very fine reports, I'm sure including your publication. All the solutions are on the table. Now you've got to get them done. Is that something that you believe should be priority number one, getting things done rather than now thinking about them?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the failure to get things done really accounts for the slowdown that we have seen. I mean, it's the rise of, on one hand, a regulatory regime that has been quite pernicious. But the complement to that has been the failure of the political class to actually focus on the outcomes they want to see.
Right.
And I think implementation is really the first order of business if we have to see India get out of the rut. There's no alternative.
What are the first three things? I know, we can always debate whether it should be that three, but what are the first three things that you think the next Prime Minister, the next government should say, let's come down and let's get it done?
On the implementation part or the broader?
On the implementation.
On the implementation part, I think the first thing is to restore the collective responsibility of cabinet. And it's much more important than one tends to think. Scrap all GOMs, e-GOMs, all of that stuff.
Right, so they're saying, what you're saying is a lot of it had been farmed out to these...
That's correct. You can't outsource the responsibility of cabinet.
Of the cabinet. Yeah.
To restore and empower the bureaucracy, and part of the problem was the bureaucracy was not taking decisions at all. The third one, I would say, is streamline the clearances, which is, I mean, the forest clearances, and there are ways of doing it. Don't make them open-ended, don't make them retrospective, so streamline those procedures, because in my diagnosis, the problem of the last few years has not been legislative, it has fundamentally been administrative.
Dheeraj, it falls to you now to sum up this whole thing for us.
No, I mean, on the point of ideas versus implementation, actually, if you look at countless government documents, including from the Obsolete Planning Commission and from economic surveys, every government, even over the last 3-4 years, says all the right things. I mean, we know we've got to invest in education.
Even the templates exist.
Even the templates exist. Even ready-made reports exist now. Like this book will be a ready-made solution. We've done our Change India thing, which also offers exact action points. There are other more specific things which are ready, including the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, which has already done a lot of groundwork.
Which is ready to go.
So there's actually a lot of stuff which is ready to go. Now it just needs political will. And I think Vivek talked about restoring the authority of the cabinet. I would say restore the authority of the Prime Minister's office as well. I mean, somebody's got to take the lead. You're Prime Minister, you're not a regular minister. You've got to pull heads together of the cabinet. There are going to be divergent views, obviously, even within your party. But you've got to lead and you've got to start getting things done. And once you start getting things done, then the rest will follow.
Okay, so one of the big challenges for the next Prime Minister is going to be where to place himself on this trade-off between consensus and, come on guys, let's get it done. Let's stop talking. And I suspect he'll have to be much closer to the point on let's get it done and much further away from the point of consensus. Well, this was our curtain raiser to India Back on Track. We will have 2 more discussions closer to the publication of the book, which is in June when the new government takes office. You stay with us as we get deeper into this fascinating publication. Thank you for being with us today.